I'm David Wayne Kuhn, and it's my honor and privilege to serve as the Superintendent President of the College of Marin. On behalf of our Board of Trustees, thank you. On behalf of our Board of Trustees, our faculty, staff, and students, we welcome you to the James Dunn Theater here at the College of Marin. Speaking of James Dunn, I would be remiss in not inviting you back to campus next Sunday right here in this theater. Dave, can you kill the music? You're a sharp group. This is great. I like this. Okay. I hear no music. I thought it was voices I was hearing in my head. Okay. We'll try that again. Speaking of James Dunn, I would be remiss in not inviting you back to campus next Sunday as we celebrate Jim's life and 54 years of service to the college and the greater community. And we'll be celebrating his life right here next week. Thank you for joining us this morning for this important dialogue. College of Marin is honored to host our neighbor and friend, Congressman Huffman, for this town hall meeting. And we're glad to have him back. Representative Huffman is not only a friend of the college, absolutely, we like him for lots of reasons, but he's certainly a strong supporter of education. We've had the pleasure of hosting 2 of his previous town halls, a roundtable discussion, and we were honored to have him address the graduating class of 2014 as our keynote speaker. Representative Huffman's efforts around education reform and making higher education affordable are appreciated by the college community as well as the constituents throughout his 6 counties that he represents. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage or to the podium, Congressman Huffman.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you very much, David Wayne Kuhn, and what a beautiful theater. This new facility. I want to thank the College of Marin for being our host, and I want to thank the public who passed the bond measure that paid for this beautiful facility for doing that. We also want to give a very important thank you to my staff here in Marin County. They worked very hard to pull these events together, so my gratitude. They are, by the way, working the room with cards that I'll explain a little more. Some of you have probably already figured out that Michelle over here and a few other of my staffers have these cards. That's how we're going to take your questions. So please flag them down, and I'll explain that more in just a minute. Let me take a moment to welcome at least one elected official I see in the room, Supervisor Dennis Rodoni back here. If there are any other elected officials, please shout out who you are. I just haven't been able to see you yet. Are we joined by any other? Oh, Larry Bedard, of course, on the Marin Hospital Board. Welcome, Larry, doctor. Did I miss anyone? Rachel Kurtz from the school board, San Rafael School Board. Where are you, Rachel? Back there. Okay, Rachel, thank you. Terrific. And then a final thank you to the Community Media Center of Marin. They are live streaming this event. And that's important because not everybody can get here in the middle of the day, and we know there's a lot of interest out there, so thank you for doing that. And I want to just go to the run of the show here and a little bit of the housekeeping. After some brief remarks by me and our amazing panelists, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, we will have an audience-directed conversation, and we'll do that, as I just alluded to, with these question cards. Again, just raise your hand if you want to get a card, and you can start filling it out anytime. But the reason we do this is because it helps ensure that we cover lots of different subjects. And I've found at these town hall meetings that if you just go with the randomness of passing microphones around, sometimes you can get, just all one point of view. So if you came here with a unique point of view, with an important burning question that might even be a provocative one, please know that we're using these cards to make sure we get to questions like that and not to do any filtering or screening. The only thing we're going to do along those lines is we might combine some of the questions if they are repetitive to make sure that we are covering as many topics as possible. I will exercise the moderator's prerogative to send out the first question to our panelists, and I may jump in a time or two during the discussion. Otherwise, it's going to be your questions that guide this conversation. And I just want to emphasize one last thing. This is not a partisan event or a campaign rally just for one political party. It's a public forum. And I hope we'll be respectful of our friends and neighbors no matter what their political point of view may be. Every one of you has every right to be here and to express yourselves. And I think about the late John McCain. And I know that regardless of our politics, probably everyone here really admired the way John McCain set a high tone and standard of civility and respect at his political events. I especially admired the one famous town hall during his presidential campaign where a fervent supporter of his asked a question that really disparaged Barack Obama, suggesting that he wasn't an American, questioning his religion, and instead of playing along with that, John McCain took the microphone and corrected her and said, no, he's a good American and a family man. We just have some political differences. I think we can proceed in that same spirit of civility and decency in our political dialogue today, and I think it'll be a good thing for our community, and we'll be doing our part for the country as well. I have been holding a lot of town halls since the election of 2016, and the reason I did it, maybe there was some personal therapeutic value in having a chance to vent a little bit with you all, but really the main reason is I began hearing from constituents right after the election that they were hungry for information, that they really wanted a chance to come together and be part of a dialogue and feel like they were doing something as active citizens. And so we've literally had dozens of town halls since the fall of 2016, and wow, have people shown up and participated. Over 13,000 of my constituents just in that period of time have joined me in events just like this. And many of them have been open-ended general town halls, but we've also done some specific town halls in fact, this is our second town hall on the subject of holding the President of the United States accountable. The first one happened on May 9th, 2017, and you may remember that was actually the day that Donald Trump fired FBI Director James Comey. In fact, I was driving to the town hall at Dominican University when I got the Twitter note that Trump had just fired Comey. So we spent a lot of time at that town hall talking about the implications of all of that. And one of the great things about Donald Trump is he keeps giving you bombshell events to drive conversations. And so here we are today in the aftermath of an incredible week that saw felony convictions for Donald Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, guilty pleas from Donald Trump's personal attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, for paying hush money to a porn star and a playmate in a case in which, under oath, he implicated Donald Trump for felonies, essentially in a way that makes him an unindicted co-conspirator in that case. We saw immunity deals that prosecutors made with the owner of the National Enquirer and with the longtime accountant for the Trump organization in a case that seems, a state law case that seems to portend very serious legal exposure for President Trump and his family. And all of that happened in 1 week, last week. So we've got a lot to talk about. Before we dive in, there's a fundamental question that some of you may be asking, especially those who support President Trump. You may be asking, what is all this fuss about presidential accountability? What is it about this president that makes you want to talk about accountability so much? And am I just someone Steve Bannon might refer to as a snowflake who can't handle the fact that my candidate lost the election in 2016? Fair question. And I want to urge the panelists to think about that and address it perhaps in their opening remarks from their perspective. Is there something about this administration that underscores the need for accountability? And do you think that the normal channels of accountability are working right now? I think these are important foundational questions to think about, and we should be ready to answer them. I'll give you my answer. As your representative in an institution that is supposed to function as an independent branch of government, that is supposed to serve as a check on presidential power, I am concerned that Donald Trump's actions in flouting the law, norms, and institutions of our democracy are unlike anything we have ever seen from a president. And I believe unless he is held accountable, his presidency could actually pose an existential threat to our democracy and to the rule of law. I am also concerned that Congress, my institution, isn't even coming close to doing its job of holding the president accountable. And so it's my conclusion that all of us, regular citizens, elected officials, legal scholars, attorneys, journalists, all of us have to step up and do more to protect our democracy and our democratic institutions and the rule of law. And so while there are all sorts of important issues to talk about at town halls, and I do have town halls where I talk about health care and climate change and infrastructure and everything else you can think of, I think it's important to zero in on this subject we're covering today because it's that important. When a president of the United States flouts the Constitution and any reasonable standard of ethics, when he lines his pockets with emoluments, both foreign and domestic, when he refuses to take meaningful steps to address his personal financial conflicts of interest and becomes the first president in modern history to refuse to disclose his tax returns, when he does all these things, that's a big deal. When he surrounds himself with political appointees who are also using their positions to enrich themselves, it makes it even worse. Our founders knew that Americans really needed to trust that their president would always be loyal to us and not to foreign interests, that they would never abuse the presidency to make money, and that's why they put the emoluments clause into the Constitution. And when a president flagrantly violates it, that matters. It has to matter. That's why I'm proud to be one of nearly 200 members of Congress who are suing Donald Trump in court right now under the Foreign Emoluments Clause. Our case is slowly but surely working its way through the legal system. Now, it also matters, I believe, when a president blatantly and consistently lies, when they're dishonest. It has to matter. And you may say that biographers maybe went a little too far, maybe verged into hagiography when they talked about George Washington being so honest that he literally couldn't even tell a lie about a cherry tree when he was a kid. You know, there's some mythology around that, and maybe also the way Abraham Lincoln was mythologized as Honest Abe. But it's because Americans really want their president to be honest. It's really important to our country. And actually, the more we study and learn about Washington and Lincoln, turns out they really were very, very decent and honest. President Trump's constant lies, his appallingly bad behavior, his mob boss attitude toward the rule of law is taking a wrecking ball to our standards of decency and inviting us to view the presidency like a reality TV show or a pro wrestling event where no one cares about truth and integrity, and I believe we can't let that happen. Now, he may be right about his hardcore base. You know, maybe they really would watch him shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and still continue to support him. But I think he's wrong about the vast majority of Americans. I think we have a deep appreciation of honesty and integrity in our leaders. And many of us are just not willing to accept a president who delights in lying and bullying and flouting the law. We think values of truth and integrity still matter, and if we jettison them, we lose not only our credibility and moral authority on the world stage, we lose something really vital, I think, to the American ideal and to our aspirations of being a more perfect union. So that's why I wanted to be here and have this town hall on the issue of accountability. Bringing accountability to this president, for me, is not just about enforcing some technical aspect of the law or resetting some technical balance of power in the way our government is supposed to work. It's really about standing up for standards, values, and institutions that I believe define our country and are really, really important. I think we all have a role to play on this issue, and I just want to close with that. It includes not just elected officials and litigators and scholars, but it includes countless citizens, just like all of you, who really have the most power of all. Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe, said it best. He said, "Public sentiment is everything, With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And if you have any doubt about that, just take a look at what happened yesterday. The incredible public backlash about Donald Trump's mean-spirited refusal to honor the late John McCain was so great that even he had to back down and lower the flag to half-mast and issue a statement that recognized McCain's incredible contributions to our country. So your engagement matters. Public sentiment matters, and I want to thank all of you for participating in this dialogue today. With that, let's get to the panelists. When I set out to put this panel together, I really wanted to make sure we covered certain bases. I wanted a constitutional law expert who could speak to the institutions and mechanisms of accountability in the Constitution and in federal law. I wanted someone who had experience working with the Department of Justice and FBI, who could speak to the central roles of those agencies as well as the special counsel's investigation. And then I also wanted someone who could speak to the role of our free press that has always been so important in holding government officials accountable, and also the implications of this administration's unique attacks on the media, or at least anyone in the media who deigns to criticize the president. I did not set out to have an all-woman panel, but in finding incredible people, I think it's pretty cool that that's the way it happened. So I want to start by introducing our guest on the right, Audrey Cooper. She is the editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Chronicle. And I have known, got a lot of Chronicle readers here, Audrey. I have known her since long before I was a legislator, and I'm just very proud of the fact that she's the youngest woman ever named as the top editor of a major U.S. newspaper company. And at a time of difficult challenges in the media world and in journalism, she has really brought some amazing leadership that emphasizes investigative and explanatory journalism. In fact, every single year under her watch, our state's top newspaper association has named the Chronicle California's best newspaper. So that's pretty impressive. On the far end, closest to me, is Caroline Fredrickson. She is the president of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. She also was previously the director of the ACLU in their Washington office, general counsel and legal director of NARAL Pro-Choice America. Before that, she was chief of staff to one of my favorite U.S. senators, Maria Cantwell, and was the deputy chief of staff, I believe, to Tom Daschle. She has a spectacular resume, graduated from Yale with a degree in Russian and East European studies. And, you know, she studied those things before Paul Manafort showed us it could be lucrative, you know. That's impressive. And then she went on to law school at Columbia Law before clerking for the U.S. Court of Appeals. In the center, Melinda, thank you. And in the middle is Melinda Haag, who also has an incredible legal resume, 28 years of prosecutorial and private litigation experience. But what really jumps out at me is that in 1999, as she was working as a partner in a San Francisco law firm, she got a call from the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of California, a guy named Robert Mueller. And he asked her to join his staff as a supervising attorney. That seems kind of significant. She went on to accept President Barack Obama's appointment to be the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of California from 2010 through 2015. A little side note that I hope she doesn't mind me sharing. Some of you may remember that during the transition, even before Donald Trump's swearing in, I was very alarmed by evidence that was already coming forward about Russian interference in the election, about ties between Trump and Russia, actions that Trump and Mike Flynn and others were taking to actively undermine the Obama administration's ability to conduct foreign policy during the transition. It included Flynn's now well-documented promises to Russia about rolling back sanctions. It included a call from President Trump to the president of Egypt to cause them to withdraw a pending United Nations resolution that actually prevented the United States from casting a vote that would have criticized Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and also a call to Philippine President Duterte telling him that the United States actually supported his extrajudicial killings. There were many other examples of this. But, we have a federal law called the Logan Act that prohibits private citizens from doing things like that, from conducting their own foreign policy and undermining the official foreign policy of our government. We also have a law that enables the Attorney General of the United States to appoint an independent special counsel to investigate potential crimes whenever it's in the public interest to do that. And since I didn't think Trump's new Attorney General would create a special counsel to investigate a Logan Act violation, I reached out to Melinda Haag, who was in private practice, but I wanted to see if she might be willing to get a group of former U.S. attorneys and maybe former attorney generals and write a letter to Loretta Lynch, who was then finishing up her term as our Attorney General, and see if they couldn't persuade her to appoint a special counsel. Melinda, to her great credit, actually took an interest in the issue, tried to get some traction. It didn't work out. At the end, most of the former U.S. attorneys felt that the Logan Act was a little bit too untested, maybe ambiguous, and that it might seem a little too political to be appointing a special counsel with one foot out the door for Attorney General Lynch. Little did I know that just 5 months later, we would have a special counsel, and it would be Bob Mueller, the guy that gave you that fateful call in 1999. And he would be investigating a slew of crimes that make a Logan Act violation, seem like small potatoes. So it all worked out. I'm thrilled to have our panelists here. And I'm going to kick things off with the congressional prerogative of asking the first question. And you all can field it in whichever way you'd like. But actually, sorry, I just went out of order. I was going to give you guys a couple minutes to introduce yourself and give opening remarks, then get ready, because then I'm going to field the first question. Okay. Caroline, you want to start?
Sure. First, I just want to say thank you to Congressman Huffman and to College of Marin President David Wayne Kuhn for hosting this, I think, very important and very timely, and potentially there may be a tweet that will make it even more timely. So if any of you are watching.
Check your phone.
One never knows these days, as there always, every day one wakes up with a pit of fear in one's stomach about what might have happened at 6 a.m. From the White House tweet room. So thanks very much for doing this, and thank all of you for coming. So I want to talk about part of this whole dynamic that often doesn't get as much attention. As much as we have discussed the guilty pleas and the special counsel investigations, we often don't talk about where that all ends up, which is in the courthouse. And so I'm going to just talk very briefly about the role of the courts and their vital part of this separation of powers, but more importantly, checks and balances in our constitutional system. As I think you all know, the Supreme Court, in so many cases, in constitutional cases, is the final say, up and until a new court or a constitutional amendment. And certainly because Congress has a very hard time in fixing decisions by the Supreme Court that are wrong on statutory cases, it's often also the final say on interpretations of federal statutes. So it's a vital and essential piece of the checks and balances in our system. And that's why I want to just talk very briefly about something that's coming up that bears on how our constitutional system functions generally, that is the Supreme Court, but also very specifically on the issues that the congressman has already raised involving the Mueller investigation, involving President Trump, and the Russia investigation. And that is the confirmation hearings for Judge Kavanaugh that will open in the Senate next week. It's a really important piece of this puzzle because not only does Judge Kavanaugh's record give a lot of concern to people like me who are progressives who care deeply about Roe versus Wade, women's reproductive rights, who care about the right to vote and protections for the vulnerable in our system. but also care very much about rule of law. Judge Kavanaugh, in addition to having, I think what many of us would agree are very troubling opinions about what he has called settled law, like Roe v. Wade, which doesn't mean much when it's the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court can unsettle as much law as it wants to. But very particular to this situation, Judge Kavanaugh has embraced a position on the constitutional structure that is incredibly troubling for the Mueller investigation. That is, he is a proponent of something called the unitary executive. And the unitary executive is a theory that comes out of the right that basically, to put it very simply, says the president is above the law. The president has the sole power in the executive branch, and that would be over the Mueller investigation, over Jeff Sessions, over any part of the investigation that is underway. In the Bush administration, some of you might recall that the unitary executive was the theory that gave him what he thought was the power to issue signing statements that said, I'm not going to enforce this, that, and the other under the law that Congress passed. No, I'm not going to enforce that because it conflicts with my view of my incredible powers. But also to justify torture. The president used the unitary executive to justify his ability to disregard congressionally passed statutes as well as treaties like the Geneva Conventions that call torture a crime. So Judge Kavanaugh is in that camp. He did work in the Bush administration. He worked in the White House counsel's office, and he had a very important position in the White House called staff secretary, which some people think is not so significant because it has the word secretary attached to it. It is actually one of the most important jobs in the entire White House and is deeply embedded in every policy decision. So that brings me to the last point I want to make about Judge Kavanaugh and these hearings and why this is such an important piece of this. Because Judge Kavanaugh's record has not been made available to any of the senators, the Democratic senators in particular, but certainly not to the broader public. It's an extraordinary situation because the National Archives has all of his records from the White House period. They're saying they can't produce them until the end of October. The Republicans in the Senate are pushing forward anyway, and the person who is reviewing these records that they are looking at are actually coming out of the Bush administration, George W. Bush's library. They've put in charge of the process to review Kavanaugh's records a guy named Bill Burke, who is the private attorney to Steve Bannon, as well as the George Bush Library. But guess what? He also worked for Judge Kavanaugh in the Bush White House. This is the man who's deciding which of the records available to the Bush Library are going to go to the Senate, and then even smaller amount is going to be made public. So that is what we're looking at, 2% of Judge Kavanaugh's record. So we have a situation where we have a nominee to the Supreme Court who has a deeply held view of presidential power that is very problematic right now. He has articulated his disagreement with the U.S. v. Nixon case, which made the president subject to a subpoena to turn over tapes, remember those, in Watergate? This is a man who could be confirmed to the Supreme Court without any of us knowing what's in his record that gives us even more insights into his view on presidential power. The Supreme Court may soon have to rule on a case pertaining to Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. As Congressman Huffman said, we had a game changer just last week with the guilty pleas and the guilty verdict of Cohen and Manafort. These cases make the Supreme Court the vital place where these issues are going to be decided. What will happen? So I'm going to just say to all of you that as much as we want to focus on the White House and as vital as Congress is, the Supreme Court is where this may all get decided in a way that will not be reviewable. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate the attention that you provide to these issues and your embrace of the vital need for all of us to uphold rule of law in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
Well, on that uplifting note, I will take the microphone for a minute. Thank you so much for having me, Congressman Huffman. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the other thing that was going on when we were talking about the Logan Act is that most of my colleagues that had not stepped down yet then were fired.
Yeah.
So that was the other thing that put an end to that. But I did have the incredible honor of serving as the United States Attorney here, nominated by President Obama in 2010. And I think I'm here to tell you how what we're experiencing now with respect to the Justice Department and the White House is not normal. And the idea that people are watching what's happening and somehow thinking it's normal or not questioning what's going on is incredibly disturbing, especially when you saw it work in an entirely different way. And so I worked for Eric Holder as the Attorney General for the most part. Loretta Lynch came in later on in the game, and President Obama. And one of the first things that happened was in a private setting, so not everybody knows what's normal because President Obama didn't choose to do these things publicly, which was appropriate, I thought. But in a private setting, he told the United States attorneys, a political process got you here because you're all recommended by your senator. So Senator Boxer recommended me to the president. But you need to check politics at the door because you don't serve me, you don't serve the White House, you serve the people of this country. I expect you to check politics at the door. I never expect you to take actions based on politics. That's what he told all of us behind closed doors. That's what's right, that's what's normal, and what we're experiencing now is not that. The things that we were working on in the Department of Justice during that administration were incredibly important, and by the way, had widespread bipartisan support. Criminal justice reform. There was a huge bipartisan belief, that we have a mass incarceration problem in this country and we have an over-criminalization problem in this country. And that was probably the biggest initiative that we were working on during President Obama's administration in the Department of Justice. We were looking for candidates for clemency. Every U.S. attorney was tasked with looking out there. The war on drugs resulted in people serving extraordinarily lengthy sentences in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. Look for those people. Look for people that we should be granting clemency to, because we have a process in place. We want to consider earlier release for people who have served decades in prison for nonviolent drug offenses for the most part. We were addressing youth violence. We were addressing policing issues in this country, certainly since the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And my office, not unlike others, we had the sober responsibility of addressing law enforcement misconduct. We work with law enforcement every single day. We have great respect for law enforcement, but when there was a problem, it was our responsibility to step up and address it. That was a huge responsibility and a huge priority for the Department of Justice. And again, all of these efforts were bipartisan. Never once in my time as the United States Attorney did I feel there was political interference. Never once was I directed to do something for political reasons. Never once did I feel any pressure from the White House whatsoever. And there were certain things, one I can talk about in particular, where it might have happened, but it didn't. We indicted 4 Chinese state-owned entities in connection with the theft of trade secret case 3 weeks before the Vice President of China was coming to visit. And I figured I better tell the AG that was the plan, so then he could convey that to the White House. I did that. That's the last I heard of it. We sought those indictments. They were returned. The Vice President of China came. I'm sure there might have been an awkward moment or two, but there was no political interference whatsoever. 20 months after this administration has begun, the world feels just so entirely different to me as somebody who was inside the Department of Justice and inside this world. The idea that the president would constantly tweet his displeasure with the Attorney General is astounding to me. The idea that the president would criticize somebody like Bob Mueller is astounding to me. When Bob became the special counsel, of course, everybody in a bipartisan way was was lauding him to the ends of the earth, which he deserves, every bit of that. He's an extraordinary person. The idea that he's being criticized publicly is astounding to me. The idea that the White House is calling Justice Department investigations witch hunts over and over and over again is astounding to me. The idea that the president is tweeting criticism of and talking about revoking the security clearance for somebody like Bruce Orr is astounding to me. The president would have paid no public attention to any of the U.S. attorneys who he appointed. But the idea that the president, and much less somebody way down the food chain, Bruce Orr I know him, is a lifelong public servant, dedicated Justice Department lawyer, trying to do his job, and now the president is speaking publicly about him and talking about revoking his security clearance. He won't be able to work if his security clearance is revoked. So the idea that the president is issuing pardons to people like Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Arizona is astounding to me. As I said, we had this process for clemency. It had nothing to do with politics. The people we were considering for clemency were not popular, they were not well known, they would not provide any political benefit to anybody. They were people who it was believed had received an unfair sentence during the war on drugs and were serving decades in prison. Those were the people we were looking for. Those were the people that President Obama was granting clemency for. And so the idea that the president is reaching out and using those kinds of powers for people like Sheriff Joe Arpaio and others is astounding to me. It's astounding to me that people that are extraordinarily close to the president, Paul Manafort, Michael Cohen, General Flynn, and others are in significant legal jeopardy. That's astounding to me. None of this is normal. And I'm fear that we're all now, so, things happen every day, things happen every week. We feel like it's normal, and it's not. The last thing I'll talk about is, just very briefly, just in case it engenders some questions, is that I feel like a little bit like Forrest Gump watching the news, because although I'm not important in this administration, certainly, I feel like I know everybody that's in the news every day, and it's just, and I'm, sending them texts and emails behind the scenes. But Bob Mueller, who I've known since 1999 and have extraordinary respect for, a number of the people on his team, the president's calling them the angry 17 Democrats or something like that. These are public servants. Andrew Weissman is a public servant. Michael Dreeben, who is the legal eagle on Bob Mueller's team, is the smartest person I know. I don't know if you've encountered him. He's extraordinary and not at all political, just doing his job. Sally Yates, we were U.S. attorneys together, and she was fired, fired by the president for refusing to uphold and to argue in favor of and to support the Muslim ban in this country, and she got fired for that. Chris Wray, the current FBI director, is an old friend, a wonderful person. I don't know what he's thinking, but he must be in private moments thinking a lot. Rod Rosenstein was the U.S. Attorney in Maryland in the Obama administration. He may not be perfect, none of us are, but he has a man of integrity, and I hope that he will perform that and uphold those values in the role that he currently sits in. Rob Khuzami is an old friend. He is the acting U.S. Attorney for Michael Cohen. The actual U.S. Attorney was appointed by President Trump, so he recused himself from that case. Rob Khuzami served in the role of deciding whether it was okay to go forward with Michael Cohen. He's an old friend. All these commentators you see on CNN and MSNBC are my old colleagues. Preet Bharara from New York, Joyce Vance, Barb McQuaid, Michael Moore from Georgia, and others. Again, I feel like Forrest Gump, Loretta Lynch, Jim Comey, who I worked with. So we're all watching this unfold with great interest. We were backstage looking at our cell phones to make sure nothing big had happened before we came out here. You never know. And I, too, am watching with great interest with the added layer of, these are my friends. And I'm grateful to all of them for hanging in there and doing what they need to do to help all of us and to help the country move forward. So thank you for having me here.
Well, I'll keep this brief because I saw the stack of questions come down. But being on the panel with you ladies today reminds me that when I grew up, I was born in Topeka, Kansas, and one Kansan in the room, and I wanted to be Sandra Day O'Connor when I grew up. That was like who I was going to be. I was a judge for Halloween, and like for 5 years in a row, and it's because I grew up in a house of Reagan Republicans, and it was the only woman that I had ever seen in a position of authority at all. And then I realized you had to go to law school to be a judge. And then I decided I wasn't going to do that. So I'm a journalist now, and that's the end of the story. But really, there was a point in my life where I realized that the one thing that I thought could affect our government more than the judiciary was possibly the free press. And and now we're at a time and place where I feel like we're being challenged on three fronts. By our ad model, which has changed with the invention of the internet, by tech companies who've built their platforms on the legitimacy of publishers and are now saying that that fake news things we have news is messy, it makes you grouchy, so we're going to deprioritize news on Facebook. And then also by people in power, and notably the president, but I would certainly not limit it to him because I think a lot of politicians nowadays on the right and the left, believe me, in San Francisco, I see this personally a lot more from the left than the right just because of where we live. But the ability to discredit the messenger is more powerful than ever before, partially because of the weaponization of social media, but also because we're all busy and being informed takes a lot of effort. And what I like to tell people whenever I get the opportunity to say anything is my most fervently held belief, someday I might get it tattooed on my back or something, is that there is no such thing as a right to an uninformed opinion. But that takes a lot of, but that takes a lot of effort on your part to not fall into that. So meanwhile, when you're already looking for an excuse not to open your phone or your Twitter app or your news app or your newspaper in the morning, the discrediting of the media fuels that justification that you already kind of secretly want to do because you have stuff to do in your life. And so I would just say two things. The first is you don't become a journalist just because you have a computer and a Wi-Fi connection. The profession of journalism is blurry on the edges, but journalism is like pornography. You know it when you see it. And I would say also, if the news isn't making you mad, regardless of your political affiliation, then you're not doing it right. Because my job is to provoke and incite and inspire civic discourse. And I think there's one word in there that gets overlooked, and that's the civil part of it. And things should be uncomfortable, and your ideas should be challenged. That's my job. So what you can do in all of this is make sure that you come to terms with the fact that you're going to be angry sometimes, and that you need to challenge your own beliefs all the time. That means going out and reading. It means subscribing, and it means subscribing to, I'm sorry, but more than one place too, because we all need your help. The Times and the Post are amazing, amazing reporting machines, but they're not reporting on your backyard. And even your local paper isn't reporting on what's happening in the whole of California in the same way. I just subscribed to the Fresno Bee, let me tell you, because they had this crazy story about Devin Nunes, did you see the story? He refused to talk to the Fresno Bee, but so did 8 other Congress people. The Fresno Bee. So I subscribed to the Fresno Bee this week. And the last thing I would say is, I know you're not going to do it anyway, but I would just implore you to get off Facebook and Twitter. It's not the place. All right, good. It's not the place for that discourse anymore, if it ever was, and we're allowing ourselves to get dragged into the basest parts of ourselves with it. So, That's it. Thanks.
Wow. Wow. There's a lot there. Audrey, is it okay if they continue to follow me on Facebook and Twitter?
Do I not follow you?
Can they still? I don't know if you do.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right, we've got some great questions coming in. I'm going to take this prerogative to toss out the first one. Lots of discussion this past week about Trump firing Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Obviously, because of his unwillingness to shut down the Russia investigation, Trump has made that plain, that he's never going to really reconcile to that. And we have these seemingly choreographed tweets from the president and then statements from Lindsey Graham and Chuck Grassley that seem to indicate there's a play on to get rid of Jeff Sessions probably right after the midterm elections. And I want to ask our panelists, what are the implications of this? What does it mean for Rosenstein, for the Mueller investigation, and for the rule of law, and what can we do if that happens to protect the Mueller investigation?
What happens. So I think Sessions is making it clear that he's not going to resign by responding to the president as he did recently and said, we're never going to be influenced by politics. That was a big move by him, and I actually think that he needed to do that for the men and women of the Department of Justice. It would be very hard. President Obama and Eric Holder are very good friends, so we were never criticized by the president. It would be very hard to work for an organization where the president is criticizing your organization, components within your organization like the FBI, and your leader all the time. It would be very demoralizing. And so I do think that Sessions needed to do that. But I think he's made it clear that he's not going to quit. So if the president fires him, it's like a mapping exercise, and I would invite everybody to jump in because it's difficult to follow all this. But if the president fires him, Rod Rosenstein becomes the attorney general, acting attorney general, without if he just simply fires him. I think that's right. And so I don't think the president would want to do that, right? So he can actually appoint somebody to act as the attorney general, but that person has to already be Senate confirmed. So it has to be somebody that's already sitting in a Senate confirmed seat in Washington. So it could have been Scott Pruitt, but not anymore.
Thankfully, yeah.
So the president's going to have to find somebody who he's comfortable with, who's already Senate confirmed, that will go in, because Rod is the acting attorney general in the Mueller investigation because Sessions recused himself. Normally it would be the AG. So if an AG comes in that is not conflicted, that person would take it over. So that's the first mapping exercise, is that. The president could fire Rod Rosenstein. The president cannot fire Bob Mueller, but the president can direct somebody that works for him to fire Bob Mueller. Bob Mueller can technically only be fired for cause, but maybe I'll turn it to Caroline because I think she has views on whether the special counsel rules say that Bob can only be fired for cause, but there may be people that disagree with that.
Right, well, thank you. It's a tremendously complicated area, the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, which governs who gets to hold that position and for how long and what they can actually do. But I would say, to come back to what I was talking about with Brett Kavanaugh, with Judge Kavanaugh, the unitary executive, the people who believe in that theory, like Judge Kavanaugh, and this has been mentioned many times by people close to the president, by his lawyers, by the president himself, he thinks that he can fire Bob Mueller directly, because he thinks this idea that there are regulations in the Department of Justice that control the appointment and the removal of a special counsel and restrict the removal to just cause, he thinks those are illegitimate interference with his constitutional powers to control everybody in every position in the executive branch. So Donald Trump may go ahead and try and fire Bob Mueller directly without having to go through Sessions and Rosenstein and everything. But the one thing I did want to just say is, as much as we sometimes think about Jeff Sessions and we think about Bob Mueller, that it's Rod Rosenstein who is actually a vital piece of this, and that as important as it is to protect the Mueller investigation, protecting Rod Rosenstein is actually the key to that. Because as long as he is there, neither Jeff Sessions nor who's replacing Jeff Sessions, unless that person is, of course, not recused, adds a layer of complexity here. But it's Rosenstein who is overseeing the Mueller investigation because he is the acting attorney general with respect to that investigation. So anyway, it's a mess, but.
Audrey, anything to add?
No, but I have a question. Do either of you have an opinion about how long the investigation might still take?
Yeah, it's really hard to know. What I can say is it is moving extraordinarily fast.
Yeah.
Extraordinarily fast. How long has it been? Not that long.
Way faster than than Whitewater, way faster than the Benghazi
Incredible.
endless drama.
Right. 13 Russians
Yeah.
have been indicted. 12 Russians for hacking, 13 Russians for election interference. Cohen, Manafort, Flynn, Papadopoulos, the young Alex van der Zwaan,
Yeah.
the young lawyer at Skadden Arps in New York, a Californian, also Pinedo, I think, has pled.
Immunity deals?
Right, for the CFO of the Trump Organization, yes. So that is extraordinarily fast, first of all. How long it will take depends on a lot of things that we don't know. It's kind of hard for me to imagine it's going to be more than another 6 or 12 months. I'm sure Bob and I'm sure his wife really want him to wrap this up.
Audrey, hang on to the microphone because we have a couple questions that are media related. One of which you partially answered in your opening remarks, and that is how can we do more to protect and keep safe reporters and journalists besides subscribing to their papers? But if you have more to add, we welcome that. And then there's this great question about fake news. How do we get people to discern fake from real news? And does the media play into the fake news Trump narrative? I often hear back from people who are more sympathetic to Trump that they think the media has been so over the top that some of his fake news mantra actually resonates with them. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, I would say to the first question about supporting us, I mean, I didn't used to say this publicly, but it's pretty scary nowadays. I mean, I know I've had to dramatically increase the security on my home, and for the next 2 weeks, we have 4 different active shooter drills in the newsroom right now that we are having to do. These are things that never happened before in the newsroom, and we're in San Francisco. I mean, we're in bubble land, so it can be pretty scary. On the other hand, I have more people than ever before saying, "Are you okay?" I mean, nobody cared if I was okay before, so I'm like, "Yeah, I'm doing great." And as for the second question, I think one of my I even chided the police officer backstage. He said, "Well, I saw on the news." I'm like, "That's not the news. That is a television station that you saw that on. That is different." Because we paint the media like it's all one thing, and we don't think we're all one thing. We can barely all have beers together. So I think it's a matter of, I don't watch cable news. I think it's noxious. I think and it doesn't matter which one it is, I think when you have an opportunity, I remember the last time I really watched, I was in a hotel room, and it might have been CNN, but it might have been MSNBC, and the anchor was yelling at, I want to say it was Sessions before he was confirmed, like, "Won't you tell the president that there is no, fake voters, and that's not what this is, and there are no illegal immigrants voting in California." And they were just badgering each other back and forth, and I was just screaming. I'm on the elliptical in the hotel gym. I'm like, "Why don't you just send a reporter down to report on voting acts abuses and things that would be so much more useful to discourse?" But it's expensive, it's not good TV, and that's not what people want to see. So I think there's legitimate criticisms that cable news has deteriorated to a point where it's not useful for discourse at all. Mm-hmm. And so yes, there just like there are good attorneys out there and bad attorneys. There are good dog catchers and bad dog catchers. There are good congressmen and bad congressmen. That every profession has that, and I'm not going to say that we don't. But it's usually pretty obvious, I think. Bad journalists, really unethical ones, don't stay in our business very long. They certainly don't stay in my newsroom very long. You can tell by the bylines that are missing which ones, get moved out for those reasons too. But on the other hand, truly fake news, which is different than news you don't like, truly made up news can be very difficult to spot. I've clicked on stories from Twitter that I'm like, wow, is that really true? And then I'm like, I've read whole stories and be like, this seems incredible. And I'm a professional, so it is definitely hard. That's why I think you have to get a lot of different inputs that you trust instead of relying just on Twitter and Facebook to be your news distribution mechanisms.
Great. Thank you. So the next question is a little bit of a counterpoint. Joseph asks, shouldn't Russian election interference be discussed in conjunction with the dozens of times that our own country has interfered in elections? And how is Russian election interference any different than some of the dirty tricks that we've seen, such as the Bush campaign and what they did to John McCain, spreading rumors that he had an illegitimate African-American child, and so forth. So this seems like maybe a political question that I could start out with. You're welcome to chime in. But I think this is a moral relativism question. It's a whataboutism exercise that attempts, I think, to deflect from the question that we're concerned about with the Trump administration by pointing out that, and with Russian interference, yeah, the United States has done some bad things, and yeah, the Bush campaign did bad things. I believe they can both be bad. I think it's bad when the United States interferes in legitimate elections around the world. That doesn't mean it somehow means we can't criticize Russia for doing it. And similarly, I detest the tactics that the Bush campaign used against John McCain, but that doesn't mean that what Russia did in our 2016 election is somehow excused, because there's been other bad conduct. So there's just so much whataboutism and moral relativism that enters this conversation when we talk about holding Trump accountable that I'm glad the question was asked. I think we should all be on the lookout for whataboutism and relativism, because it's frankly just, I think, a very superficial way to deflect from accountability rather than have accountability. You're welcome to add into it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something very briefly, and I guess it would just be in part that I think even more than what you've said, Congressman, about the whataboutism, I think there's also it often happens that there's a conflation of interference in elections, which is wrong and shouldn't happen, and if we've done it, we shouldn't have, versus election monitoring and assistance in helping the democratic process work. And then we have had government assistance that goes to organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy and others that sends election observers around the country. Oftentimes I've seen that sort of fake news world that has put those two things together and says, oh, the United States is always interfering in elections, and puts that whole category, because the Russians didn't like that when we did that. They don't like it when there's attention brought to voter fraud in other countries or in processes that are not actually democratic but are controlled by the ruling party. And so I think we have to be also really careful to make sure that what we're talking about is interference in elections, which is actually trying to mess with voting machines, to send messages to voters about election day is on Wednesday this year, or your polling place has moved, or the things that the Bush campaign was alleged to have done to John McCain, all of which should be and are illegal in most places.
Well, Melinda, I want to ask you specifically about this, because nobody has used this tactic of relativism more than Donald Trump, as far as I can tell. I mean, he literally is tweeting back and forth with Jeff Sessions, and when Sessions says, I'm going to not have any political interference as long as I'm the Attorney General, and then Trump tweets back, good, then look at all the bad things Hillary did. Look at all the bad things that Bruce Orr did. I mean, he's constantly trying to say it's all so bad that you really shouldn't pay attention to what I do. That would never get you very far in a court of law, would it?
No, and it actually happens every day. So when you're a prosecutor and you're investigating a case, you hear that from subjects of criminal investigations every day. It's not uncommon at all. But the question really always is, but the person that I'm looking at and tasked with looking at, has that person committed a crime? And I do think one of the differences here is what we're talking about and what the special counsel and his team are looking at is, did somebody commit a crime? It's not, was it a bad thing? Was it a moral failing? Was it a political mistake or failing? But it's really very, very focused on, was a crime committed? Is there evidence that a crime was committed? Have we satisfied each element of the crime? Did this person do it? And should we seek a grand jury indictment or a federal indictment against them? The noise of the politics, if I had to guess, all those people that, Bob and all the people that work for him are paying very little attention to all of this noise, and they're very, very laser focused on whether a crime was actually committed.
And actually, just to put a finer point on it, the hacking of the DNC, which seems to have been obviously by the Russians, I mean, the laws that they're looking at are the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and our campaign finance laws, both of which are under investigation. So when you talk about Russian interference in our elections specifically, that's what's looked at, and it's very much, they are crimes.
Anything to add, Audrey? Let's go then to a question about state law. Gary asks, what are your opinions about whether a state attorney general, for example, in New York, can indict a sitting president? And I think this question also raises some other issues that we should be thinking about with respect to state law exposure for Trump and maybe some around him or in his family. I mean, the power of the pardon does not apply to state liability, and we already have a case in New York State against the Trump Foundation that may directly implicate the president and members of his family. What are your thoughts both about whether a state attorney general could actually indict the president and the broader picture of state exposure?
That's interesting. I don't know if you've considered that question, whether a state attorney general could indict the president. The reason that there is some question about whether the U.S. Department of Justice can indict the president is based on 2 DOJ memos and I believe you can actually Google them and read them. I think at least one of them is public. That they've conducted an analysis and decided that we cannot, the U.S. Department of Justice cannot indict a sitting president. It could be done after he is no longer the president, but it can't be done while he's the president. I don't know, have you considered the question of a state AG?
It's a great question because we haven't really looked at that because no one else has put it on the table. And it's funny because we work with a lot of state AGs, Attorney General Becerra here in California, as well as Barbara Underwood, the new AG in New York, who is fabulous, by the way. She's really, really terrific. But I think there's such deference, in this constitutional structure that the president would have to be indicted by federal prosecutors that people don't generally think the state would step in. I think there is a lot of question about whether the Justice Department opinion that apparently was written originally by Robert Bork, that a president can't be indicted, whether that is actually the right decision. So I think, if one disagrees with that, then potentially, yes, a state AG could indict the president. But I think courts would be rather reluctant to have a state indict the president. I think it raises questions about federalism and our constitutional structure, which is not just checks and balances between the branches of government, but also state and federal. And so I think that there may be a real difficult time to have the courts agree that that was the appropriate way to go.
But kind of unsettled.
I'm completely unsettled. Great question, though. I'll talk to all my constitutional law professor friends and have them start writing articles about that.
By the way, I love what Audrey did a little earlier, jumping in and asking a question of a fellow panelist. Feel free to do that as we keep this conversation going. I want to just take a couple quick ones that came in. Even if there were criminal charges levied against the president, what would that mean in terms of his remaining in his seat? I think I can take a stab at that. The Constitution provides only one way to remove a president from office, and that is impeachment, a majority vote in the House, And that doesn't get him out of office in itself. There still has to be a trial in the Senate presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And that trial has to result in a 2/3 vote in the United States Senate to remove a president. It's never happened in the history of our country. I think Andrew Johnson came 1 vote short after being impeached and after a trial in the Senate. So we have come close. In the past, Nixon, for example, retired when it became clear that he would have been impeached and removed from office. But that's the only mechanism, unless somebody wants to correct me on that. Okay. Then a question about Trump's taxes. With his accountant offered this immunity deal, will Trump's taxes be opened up? And I'll give you a partial answer to that from Congress's perspective, and then there may be others who have opinions about that. The Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives has the legal authority to secure a president's tax returns and to look at them and to make them public. And they did that with Richard Nixon. And it will depend entirely on whether we have a Democratic majority after the November election. If we do have one, I guarantee you that our Ways and Means Committee chair, who's going to be Richie Neal of Massachusetts, probably on the first day, is going to ask for those Trump tax returns. And they're going to go through them very carefully. And if they believe it's in the public interest to make them public, they will. But it may be that Mueller and others have access to that, and I would invite the witnesses to speak about it.
So obtaining tax returns is a very commonplace step in a federal criminal investigation. They are considered private. So whereas the federal prosecutor can obtain a lot of evidence by way of grand jury subpoena, which is the AUSA sitting in his or her office, just typing it up and then sending it over to the bank and getting your bank records. Getting tax records is harder. You do have to go to court, and you have to get a court to order the tax the release of the tax records to the prosecutors, but it's extraordinarily common. So I would be surprised if the president's tax records are not already known to some people on the prosecution team. You'll notice that there are no leaks from the Mueller team. He doesn't leak. He doesn't talk to the press. People are saying he will never write a book. He will never do a press conference about what he's doing. I would agree with all of that. There are no leaks. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody doesn't have them.
Well, Audrey, do you think there's any chance that the Trump tax returns will end up in an unmarked brown envelope?
If anyone wants to send that, my mailing address is 901 Mission Street, 94103. We check our mail for those things. I mean, I've read that they're like literally under a guarded safe at the IRS building, and you're right, Mueller's investigation has not leaked anything. I think if anyone outside of Mueller's team or the IRS guards had access to it, it would be out already.
Yeah.
Say, I think the other place where it might show up is in the prosecution in New York, the Cohen prosecution, because they now have Wesselberg, the CFO of the Trump companies, has been granted immunity. And if anybody knows what's in Donald Trump's tax returns, I would think it would be him. And as a private company, I think there's I'm not a tax lawyer, so excuse me if I don't know all the details of that, but I assume there's a lot of fluidity between the Trump personal taxes and the Trump companies, but certainly there's somebody who knows where the bodies are buried.
Yeah. Here's a question about how Americans can make sure that a president can never meet privately with our adversaries, such as Putin, alone without any transcripts or transparency of what took place. Can the translator's notes be subpoenaed? So I think the last part of that question is our best chance of finding out what happened in the secret meeting with Putin. And I think it is conceivable if Congress changed hands and the subpoena power went to my party, we do want to know what was said behind closed doors, and we would try to subpoena the notes of the translator. Now, there may be executive privilege and other defenses that could be raised to prevent us from seeing those notes. That's the only way I can really think of prying into to that issue. Others may have different thoughts. So, another question. Before his summit meeting with Kim, President Trump issued many threatening statements to North Korea, some of which could be construed as threatening a first strike nuclear attack. What actions in Congress and for myself are you taking to oversee and control the power of the president to unilaterally begin nuclear war? I'm glad you asked that question because it gives me a chance to tell you that I am co-sponsoring a bill led by Congressman Ted Lieu to do just that, to require congressional approval before any first strike use of nuclear weapons. Jenny, I'm ready for more questions, but while she is pulling those forward, let me ask about pardons, because we got to cover the issue of pardons, and it's sort of become this palace intrigue. Does Donald Trump want to pardon Paul Manafort and perhaps others? Is he being counseled by some in his administration to use pardons, others not to? Many in Congress, in fact, I think everyone in Congress who's been asked about this has said it's a bad idea. There would be a lot of political backlash, but the issue is on everybody's mind. Could the president pardon his way out of his legal exposure? And if he tried to do that, what would be the consequence?
So I want to say two things briefly. The president cannot pardon for state crimes. So that's number one. So Cohen and Manafort are both charged with federal and with federal crimes that have equivalent state crimes. This is where the AGs come in very strongly. Tax fraud, if you are engaged in tax fraud with the federal government, you filed similar taxes with your state government, that's state tax fraud. It is not the same as federal tax fraud. So it's a separate charge. The president has no power to pardon for that. So he can go ahead and try and pardon Paul Manafort, but the state prosecutors are going to come right back and say they're picking up where the pardon leaves off, and they will be prosecuting Manafort. So he's going to go to jail one way or the other, and the president can't do that much about it. So I think that really puts a limit on the appeal of a pardon, because he's got both the downsides politically, and the person who's been pardoned doesn't have the upside of not going to jail. The second piece that's also important to remember is that if somebody has been granted a pardon, they can't plead the fifth. And so, Paul Manafort then, if Congress becomes interested in oversight, and perhaps it will be after November, he can't come up and say, I'm going to plead the fifth and I'm not going to talk about whether or not, these meetings in the Trump Tower were actually about getting these emails again that were hacked from the DNC, but they were actually, wasn't really about adoption. He can't claim the fifth. So it doesn't really help the president that way either. So I think, there are a lot of reasons to think that the pardon issue is a bit of a red herring. It doesn't seem that would be a very effective tool for Donald Trump to get out of his legal liabilities.
Have you thought about whether somebody like Manafort could invoke his Fifth Amendment rights because of the jeopardy in the state? That he could be prosecuted for state crimes, so he could invoke his Fifth Amendment rights in connection with that jeopardy?
Yes, where he has an impending state prosecution, yes. But I think in the case where he's gotten a pardon for a federal crime that doesn't have the equivalent, he can't. Right. So say a campaign finance violation or something of that nature that the AGs aren't going to prosecute under, in those cases, he couldn't.
Right. So he could invoke if he had state jeopardy. Yeah. The one interesting thing I think that relates to this is if somebody like Manafort was pardoned and then he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights, was called to a grand jury to testify against the president and invoked his Fifth Amendment rights and refused to testify, that's actually criminal contempt. So the president could pardon Manafort for refusing to testify in a grand jury against him. So that's another. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's another sort of layer, and because we know from Gerald Ford, you can actually pardon prospectively. The president could pardon Manafort in advance for any potential jeopardy down the road associated with refusing to testify, I think.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yes. So this is all true. I think the other piece of the Manafort issue is that he has another trial coming up. And another fabulous prosecutor on Bob Mueller's team is actually handling this case that's in the DC District Court, which is the Federal Foreign Agent Registration Act violations
Right.
and the money laundering cases. So a pardon can
And
actually be
witness
used
tampering.
against
I think
somebody.
witness tampering as well.
And witness,
Yeah.
right, and a pardon can actually be used against somebody in such a situation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it could be evidence of guilt. So it may be a little bit contested legally, but I think generally is expected that if you've taken a pardon, it can be used in a subsequent prosecution related to those same issues.
Okay. Hey, Melinda, while you've got the microphone, I got to ask you this. So Bob Mueller, you know him. You've worked with him. You know how prosecutions and investigations unfold, big, complex ones. I don't know if you have ever been goaded and baited by somebody that you were investigating in the media and in crazy ways like what we're seeing the president go after Bob Mueller with. But if we could be a fly on the wall in Mueller's investigation room with his team, what do you think we'd be seeing right now? And how do you think they're handling this strategy, obviously, of trying to incite and bait them and maybe even prepare the American people to support getting rid of them?
Yeah, there's actually a really good New York Times piece on Bob Mueller. There was in Sunday's paper, and I was interviewed for it, so I talked a little bit about him in that. My guess is that he doesn't care at all what's going on, that he, to the extent he can, he doesn't pay any attention to it. He certainly doesn't, is not influenced by it. And he's described in the article as being very, very much in favor of 15-minute meetings, which is very true. He doesn't waste any time talking about stuff that doesn't matter. All of this doesn't matter to whether or not there are people that committed crimes and whether there's evidence to support that, and then whether indictments should be sought. So I would guess that he's paying no attention to it. And if you were a fly on the wall, you just wouldn't hear any reference.
So you don't think
to this
he
stuff.
has a PR operation or a strategy? You don't think he cares about these polls that we see about his popularity?
Doesn't
the
care at all.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. All right. Here's a question we can all speak to. It's about what we are all doing, especially me in Congress, but I'm going to take this to include everyone, to move our political debate to be more civil and respectful, and what is being done to minimize the dysfunction and tribalism specifically within Congress. So I'll take the within Congress part of this, and everybody else is welcome to chime in. It's tough. I'll be real honest with you. I've always felt that I kept a pretty even keel and tried not to be a shrill partisan in my politics. There's something about this moment that we're in that makes it way harder than it's ever been, even for me. And occasionally I mess up. Occasionally I take the bait and say some things that upon reflection I realize, that probably wasn't too helpful. But the challenge is, what I believe we can't do is step back and be passive and normalize some of the outrageous stuff that's going on with this administration. And I think that's sort of the difficult balancing act I see. I want civility. I want collaboration and bipartisanship. I really do. But not at the price of losing our democratic institutions or normalizing crazy, outrageous, thuggish, authoritarian behavior. I have to call that out when I see it. I'll try to be as civil as I can, and I try to maintain good civil relationships with my Republican colleagues wherever I can. I have them on my podcast. We talk about the things that we can agree on, but I'm also in the arena at a moment that I think requires me to fight. So I got to fight fair. I'll try to fight fair, but I think I got to fight. I would welcome the thoughts of everyone else on that.
I have a long list. I'm really obsessed with this idea, if you can't tell. I think, number one, it's our job to provide multiple viewpoints, particularly on the opinion pages. just to be totally honest, it's increasingly difficult to find intelligent conservative commentary, because I feel like, not because it doesn't exist, because I will tell you, I just spent like 2 weeks in Kansas, and it exists. Like, people in this country have legitimate points of view. You may not agree with them, but they are a legitimate way of seeing the world. I think we're missing a true north, and ideology as a principle is sort of falling away in America, which makes it more difficult. But we are trying really hard to present those voices in our pages and online. We have started to produce every year a voter guide that has the pro, the con, and all of our coverage. So if you wanted to dive very deeply into everything and not just take our editorial board's endorsement for it, you can do that. I think that's a way technology is helping us improve as journalists. We're going to launch, hopefully in about a month, a new app for the Chronicle, which is going to, I think technology can really help us a lot here. People want bite-sized information, but they also want to know both sides. And so I've seen some really exciting designs from our design team that help get at this idea of how we present something that's more balanced. We've invested a lot in long-form journalism in the Chronicle, and I hope if you do read it every day, you've noticed that. It's been one of my major focuses as editor to do more of that, because some things you can't explain in 800 words. You need to have longer stories, and I think we are one of the few outlets, as we have the largest newsroom north of Los Angeles, all the way on the West Coast and all the way over to Texas. So not only do we have the ability to do that, I think we have the responsibility. And then also, to your point of taking the bait, like, I'm just naturally the person who takes bait more than I should. It's really bad, and I've just started blocking people on Twitter. I've blocked about probably 3,000 people now on Twitter, and that's literally not an exaggeration, because I don't think I need to. It was draining me as a person, it was draining me as a journalist, and it was distracting me with the noise of people who are trying to get a rise, and like, those are not my people, you're my people. So we need to have a more rational conversation and just block out the noise, and it's really hard to do, but that's what that block button is for.
Any other thoughts about civility? And
Sure. I was just going to say briefly, in my organization, the American Constitution Society, we are about public discourse. I mean, we have chapters all across the country. We have a very vibrant Northern California presence. And our chapters put on public events. They're mostly for lawyers and law students and law professors, but plenty of judges, elected officials, and members of the public come to talk about legal issues. We almost always have somebody who is a conservative. And I'll tell you why. One is because it's important to have more than one side presented, because it's a more interesting legal discussion. But even if you're thinking in a sort of a self-interested way, that I'm generally progressive and I'd like to have strong arguments, it's better to understand and have a civil argument about, or discussion about those issues, and understand where the other side is coming from, because otherwise, how can you really critique it if you haven't heard it? So listening is a really important part of the dialogue, and even if you don't end up agreeing, your own arguments will be stronger because you will understand and be able to rebut what the other side is doing, but hopefully you'll do that in a graceful and civil way.
great. I want to ask about the Kavanaugh confirmation. This is going to kick off next week in the Senate. You touched upon this a little bit, Caroline, in your opening remarks, but I guess there's both a political and a legal aspect to this question. Politically, do you think there's any way that this cloud of criminality that seems to be surrounding this president as he's attempting to handpick a Supreme Court justice, it appears to me at least, because of his potential views on questions of accountability that may come before him involving this president. Do you think there's anything about that that changes the politics of this confirmation? And if not, if this Supreme Court justice gets confirmed, is there any recusal or other legal mechanism to prevent this from happening?
Well, those are great questions. Number one, I think Yogi Berra said it best: nothing is over till it's over, right? And so much can happen between now and next week. Who knows who might be indicted or plead guilty, or what tweets might come out. But I mean, it's a very serious matter. I think Senator Feinstein has been incredibly strong in demanding that Senator Grassley, who's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, postpone these hearings. There is absolutely no ability of senators to exercise their constitutional role of advice and consent without having any information about Brett Kavanaugh's background in the Bush White House. You can't provide advice if you don't know what you're talking about. And so they are rightly demanding that these hearings be postponed, that they be able to review the documents, and that they can make an informed decision, as well as the rest of the senators who will have to vote after it comes out of committee. So, the Republicans don't seem to be listening very carefully right now, but I think the world is kind of collapsing around them. I do think the guilty plea and the guilty verdict are game changers here. We have a court that could have a new justice who might have been selected solely because of his views on presidential power and on whether a subpoena would actually be able to bring a president in to testify in front of a grand jury, or whether documents could be demanded from a president through a subpoena like they were in the U.S. v. Nixon case. So definitely a lot has changed. The other thing that I think we all have to bear in mind is the Senate is very closely divided. And with the passing of Senator McCain, even more so. There is certainly a potential that one Republican senator might find conscience and believe that at the very least, he or she should have a chance to look at those documents as well before casting a vote on someone who will serve for a lifetime. And Brett Kavanaugh is exactly my age, and I certainly hope I live a long time. But he's got several decades of Supreme Court service if he's confirmed. So I think any senator could say, I can wait a month. I should be able to wait 2 months and actually look at those documents.
All right. There's a question about what everyday citizens can do to support the Mueller probe, and I think the best answer to that, other than you're already being engaged, you're already doing your part individually and collectively to move the needle of public opinion on these issues, but there are actually some organizations that are doing this fast response pre-organizing around the country, and believe it or not, they have already identified locations for stand-up protests and rallies. They've even identified what triggers, what time of day the event will be triggered if the news comes out before 2 in the afternoon, et cetera. Go to this place. So it's really impressive. And while I'm not remembering the name for this, that you can go to the website, I bet somebody in this audience knows the answer to that. Is it Not Above the Law? Yes. All right. So unless Google's algorithms have been, somehow regulated by Donald Trump, you should, by typing in "not above the law," protest or rally or whatever, get the information. And you enter your zip code, and you are on a list, and you're going to get that notice, and you're going to have a chance to show up and be part of our collective outrage if and when that happens. Any other thoughts? What's that? Yeah. Is the rally at my office? Am I hosting? Okay. I'll have Danishes and coffee for everyone. We'll have some fun with this. Other thoughts about it?
Yeah, I was just going to say ACS has been participating with that coalition. We are providing legal advice about the issues. If any of you want a deeper dive into what is behind the Mueller investigation, and what we've tried to do with a project we have organized with a group called Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, CREW, we have something called the Presidential Investigation Education Project, which speaks to the very issue that Melinda raised about Bob Mueller, that he is not going to be up on a soapbox telling us all what he's up to. So we try and explain what are the legal issues, what is collusion, What is obstruction of justice? How does the pardon power function? What are the limits on it? And so if you want to look at some of those materials, it's op-eds, it's reports, and so forth. It's up on our website, acslaw.org, and you can find a lot of background that can help prepare you to go to these rallies, but also to write op-eds and talk to your neighbors and contact your relatives in Topeka, Kansas, and explain to them why it's so vital that we protect rule of law in America.
Melinda, you're going to have something to add, I know, on this, but maybe at a more technical level, a lot of people are worried that if Trump gets away with firing Mueller, that somehow all of the work that had been developed might somehow be locked away in a vault in Area 51 and never see the light of day. I mean, how are we insulated against that? How does the system itself guarantee that some of that accountability will continue to move forward?
Well, it is interesting that a guy named Neil Katyal was the acting Solicitor General during the Obama administration. And he was just, if you ever listen to a podcast that the New York Times does called The Daily, he was on it a week ago maybe. And he actually, as a 28-year-old lawyer, drafted the special counsel regulations. He worked for Janet Reno. It was in the waning days of the Reno administration when those regulations were drafted, and he was the one that coordinated it. So he talked about something that was very interesting that I didn't realize, and maybe you know this, Caroline. I've never looked into it independently, but he said, everybody's talking about Mueller's report. Giuliani is saying there's going to be a report, and everybody thinks there's going to be a report, and I don't think it's all that clear that there is going to be a report that is public. Certainly, if when the special counsel indicts people, that becomes public, and then all the evidence that is in support of that indictment, if there's a trial, certainly becomes public. But the question is there going to be a report? And what Neil Katyal said, as the drafter of the regs, is that if the special counsel wants to do something that's against Department of Justice rules or regulations, like the rule that you can't indict a sitting president. If the special counsel wants to indict a sitting president, he has to go to Rod Rosenstein and ask permission to do that because it is against the DOJ rules, policies, what have you. And then Rod decides, poor Rod, decides whether or not to allow that. And if Rod declines to let the special counsel seek an indictment of the sitting president, then a report has to go to the Judiciary Committee in the House and the Senate, and it has to go to the majority and the minority. So that is a way to get a report to Congress. Another way to get a report to Congress is for Congress to subpoena it. So I think the law is settled, and you probably know better than me, that if Congress subpoenas any report or any information from the special counsel, that the special counsel will have to provide that to Congress. So that's another way to get it. But I think it is a big question. We shouldn't all just assume that at the end of the special counsel's work, we're all going to see a report that details everything that happened.
Yeah.
That may not be the case.
But you alluded to this, the power to use subpoenas and the power of contempt of Congress changes everything. So you really, I believe, you can't overstate the significance of these midterm elections and how things turn out, because without a change in the majority, you're not going to see subpoenas used against this administration. That's obvious by now. And you're not going to see witnesses held in contempt of Congress when they raise some bogus executive privilege or other argument, or simply just refuse to answer questions they don't like, which many of the administration witnesses have done. You just won't see any follow-up from this Congress unless that changes.
Can I ask Melinda a follow-up?
Yeah.
I think this is an interesting part of this is the idea of the Mueller investigation getting shut down if he were fired. What in fact happens to those materials? And I think there's been speculation that having a prosecution in Virginia, like the current one with Manafort, and the one in New York of Gates, is a way of already spreading a lot of the materials around. Is that how it works with the U.S. attorneys?
Mm-hmm. That's certainly one way. I assume that the Cohen case was sent to New York because the special counsel decided it wasn't within their purview. There actually is direction for Rod Rosenstein that says, here's what you're allowed to do.
So you don't think it was farmed out to kind of insulate the investigation by diversifying those?
It's possible.
Yeah.
It's possible. I don't tend to believe that as readily as some, just knowing knowing the special counsel and the people on his team, because that could be viewed as a political move. And if they viewed that as a political move, I think they'd be uncomfortable doing that. Yeah. So I like to think that the reason they sent that to New York was because they felt it was outside of their purview. So it's hard to know. I think there's speculation that if Mueller was fired, there's a whole team of people that remain in the special counsel's office, and there's speculation that they would simply continue the work, and that somebody would have to fire all of them for them to stop doing their work.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating, and I really could spend all day with these incredible panelists, but we're kind of coming near the end. I want to just ask our panelists if they have any questions that they wish had been asked, or if they would like to ask each other, and then I have one final one that I'm going to use as an opportunity to wrap us up and close. Go ahead. All right. So here's the closer. One of my great constituents asks, what do you say to some of us who have given up hope that this situation is going to change? That's a pretty good question, I think, to end on. And it captures, I think, one of the central challenges of this political moment that we're living through, because it's tempting to just wallow in the pit of despair. It really is, and we've all spent some time in the pit of despair over the last 18 months or so. I've been there too. But, despair is really overrated as a as an answer to these tough questions. Like you, it drives me nuts that we have someone in the White House who, not only engages in this behavior, but seems to delight in getting away with things that others can't. I mean, this is a guy who has spent his lifetime bragging about bankruptcies and ways to avoid paying taxes and grabbing women in ways that he knows he shouldn't have, and literally bragging on videotape that you can get away with it when you're a star. And he buys his way out of these situations with his wealth. He enters into legal settlements. He enters into non-disclosure hush money agreements to continue to get away with these things. And it can just be maddening and a little overwhelming to think, gosh, now he's in the White House. Is he going to get away with all this other stuff too? All I can tell you is that I continue to draw a lot of hope from the response I see everywhere I go, whether I'm meeting with middle school students who really surprisingly and wonderfully, they get this stuff and they're fired up, and they have not accepted that this is the new normal, the way our president behaves. They think it's outrageous too, and they're starting to get politically engaged. I look at these Parkland, Florida students, and I see incredible effectiveness and inspiration. I look at the people that turn out to my town halls, and I look at all the data points that we've gotten back so far, and all the special elections and other tests along the way towards this November midterm election. So, despair is tempting. We'll all have our moments in the pit of despair, but really showing up, stepping up, doing everything we can to change the situation in our personal lives, in our community, and as American voters is the answer. And that's the best I can do by way of closing this important conversation. Thank you for joining me. I will see you at one of my next town halls, I hope. Please join me in thanking my incredible panelists.